Rove was senior advisor to President Bush and later became White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Today, he shares his reflections with us. Karl, your thoughts as we look back at this moment 19 years ago today for our country, for our history, and you just heard the president's remarks there on the ground.
I thought they were wonderful remarks. I happened to visit this morning. Every day at about 8:48 a.m. Eastern time, I get a call from my former White House assistant, Susan Ralston, who on that day called me outside Emma Booker Elementary School and told me about a plane having flown into the World Trade Center. I went over and told the president about 10 or 15 feet away that of what had happened. And a few minutes later, Condi Rice called with the same sketchy information. But this morning, Susan and I reflected on the fact that we remember every single moment of that day and of many of the days to follow. I remember going to that same site where the president is today, outside Shanksville. There was no memorial. It was a simple, beautiful field scarred by a gigantic hole, and scattered everywhere were minute pieces of metal, all that was left of that aircraft, which hit the earth with such violence that it literally disintegrated. I remember meeting shortly after 9/11 in New York, the day that the president stood atop a pile of rubble and rallied the country. A horrible moment in our life, the life of our country. And we better realize that the people who did that still exist today and harbor in the center of their ideology a hatred of all that we in this country consider to be important to being an American. Liberty, freedom, the right to choose our own direction in life, to worship as we wish, to go about our business not directed in fear and anger, but in freedom and joy. And it's a day we all ought to remember.
Karl, I can tell the emotions are still so raw for you 19 years later. And talk about that moment when President Bush, days after this happened, stood on the rubble, firefighters surrounding him, and said, "I can hear you."
Yeah, it happened by accident. A White House advance woman named Nina Bishop had decided that the people of America needed to hear from the president. She had brought the issue up at a meeting the night before the president's visit to New York and had been shot down. So when we came to the final stop, to the next to final stop in New York, she basically provoked the moment, and it happened entirely by accident. And you remember the moment the president has got his arm draped over of a firefighter, a retired firefighter, a wonderful human being who was there by accident. He'd woken up on the morning after 9/11 and said, I've got to go, and was volunteering every day at 9/11 at the site. And you're right, it was a moment of you know, the president started to talk. He'd never used a bullhorn before. Somebody yelled at him, "I can't hear you," and he finally figured out the trigger on the bullhorn, and the rest is history. And it was what the American people needed to hear. I'll tell you, there was an almost equally powerful moment later in the day that the American people did not see. And the president went to the Javits Center, which had a convention center which had been turned into a staging area, been turned into a dormitory for all these rescue workers that were coming from around the country to help. And there was a shift coming off work and a shift coming out. And so the president was there to thank the workers as they came back in and to wish those that were going to work well. And after that went on for an hour or two, the president was supposed to go into a parking garage in which there had been a temporary room set up with pipe and drape, and he was supposed to spend roughly 45 minutes, I believe, meeting families of the fallen, of people who had died, first responders who had died on 9/11. And he went into that pipe and drape room and emerged nearly 2.5, 3 hours later, because he stood there and talked to every single one of those people who had lost a loved one and grieved with them and prayed with them, hugged them, cared for them, wept with them. It's the most amazing moment I think I've ever seen in private. Nobody ever saw it except the people in that room. And that's where one of the officers, one of the mothers of an officer who lost his life that day, gave the president his badge and said, "I do not want you to ever forget what happened here." And for the rest of his time in office, President Bush carried that badge with him virtually every single day in his pocket as a reminder of his duty as President of the United States to keep us safe. And he did keep us safe.
Thank you for sharing that story, Karl. Trace is here as well.
Yeah, Karl, Trace, I just want to jump in because I remember hearing the president talk about later that day. We all saw him up on the pile of rubble on Ground Zero giving the "I can hear you" speech. But you know, later in the day, he talked about that. It was really heartrending to hear him kind of recount some of that. I want to take you back earlier in the day, Karl, because we all know, we all saw the video. So many times we've seen, you know, the president in that schoolroom in Florida and Andy Card walking in and giving him the news. And I'm wondering what was going on behind the scenes at that time, Karl? What was the plan? What was the hope when you got the president out of the school? Was there a plan, or was this just kind of taking it step by step? What was the action behind the scenes?
Well, first of all, we were in a room, an adjacent room called the staff hold, and we had I'd stolen a television from another classroom and plugged it into the wall. We had a television. We had a couple of special telephones called STUs, secure phones that are put at every site where the president travels. And when the second plane flew in, Andy knew he needed to go tell the president. And I remember watching Andy walk over to the door, separating this room from the adjacent classroom. And I remember at the time that he stopped at the door, and it seemed like an eternity. It was probably just a second or two. But until years later, I didn't understand what had happened. Andy got to that door and realized he needed to know exactly what he was going to say to the president so that the president wouldn't have any questions. So that, because there were cameras and photographers and press, and he didn't want to have the president break up the reading demonstration that was being conducted in that room. He wanted to be able to tell the president in such a way that the president knew exactly what was happening. And so he walked in and said the words, "A second plane has hit the World Trade Center. America is under attack." Now, the president had a decision to make, which was, should he immediately get up and leave the room, or should he wait until the reading exercise finished? He thought it was a matter of moments before it finished. It actually took several minutes. What a terrible thing to be, to sit there and realize that you needed to get on, but you didn't want to stand up and sort of walk out of the room and create a sense of panic. So he waited. And when he came back into the room, I've known him a long time. We met when I was 22 years old, and he was 26. So I've known him a long time, and I can read his moods. And a different person walked into that room that morning. When he came back into that room, his voice was, you know, there was a little bit of anxiety in the room, but he had a voice calm as cold steel and said, "We're at war. Give me the director of the FBI and give me the vice president." And we jumped on the phones. We got a hold of Director Mueller. We couldn't get Richard B. Cheney, Vice President of the United States, because he was being rushed down a hallway to a secret entrance to the PIOC, the President's Emergency Operations Center. But there was no, quote, plan. And we sat there. The president said, "I need to say something to the country." And so Ari Fleischer, Dan Bartlett, and I were standing with him as he sat at a little table. The furniture in the room was only meant for kindergartners. So he's sitting at a table, and we were talking about what it is that he wanted to say. And in walked Eddie Morenzel, the head of the Secret Service detail, small guy, really terrific human being. He said in a very quiet, firm voice, "Mr. President, we need to get you to Air Force One and airborne as rapidly as possible." They were worried that having everybody knew where he was, and they were afraid that somebody was going to fly a plane into the Emma Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida, and kill the President of the United States.
You know, it's amazing. You just mentioned Ari Fleischer, and he is documenting and tweeting throughout the morning and remembering and looking back at each of these moments, which clearly all of you remember so clearly. And he just wrote a few moments ago, unlike most Americans who are watching every second of this on TV, communications aboard Air Force One amazingly were poor. TV reception was old and spotty. We didn't have satellite TV, which meant we were only occasionally able to watch live TV when a ground antenna signal was strong. It's so important to look back at, I mean, obviously so much has changed over 19 years, but look back at the technology, and the lines of communication were even much slower and different at that point. As we
That's right.
all
We didn't
were.
have.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we didn't have dish TV like you have on every aircraft today. We had one. I had to carry a BlackBerry that was not government issue in order to do any political communications. That was the only device that we had on Air Force One that people could use to send an email to their spouse or their family saying, "I'm okay." And so we passed the BlackBerry around, and people were emailing off of it, and the messages would back up until we flew over a town and could pick up a wireless signal and download them. but very primitive communications back then, which is why Air Force One was upgraded and the communication systems were upgraded. And within a very short period of time, we had television signal, satellite TV on the plane, but we didn't that morning. When we got ready to go to the airport, normally I'd be in a car 2 or 3 cars behind the presidential limousine, the Beast. And that morning, for whatever purpose, the president whistled at me and pointed to the back seat of the limousine. So I rode to the airport with him. And we normally a presidential motorcade, you've seen them, they go about 40, 45 miles an hour. We pulled out of that elementary school and we began going about 80 or 85 miles an hour. And nobody said anything. The phone rang as we were driving to the airport. A little phone on the side of the right side of the Beast. The president picked it up. I could only hear one side of the conversation, but I knew it was bad when he said, "Is Rumsfeld alive?" It was the news of the strike on the Pentagon. And at that moment, I couldn't look at the president. I looked to my left and realized that if I could roll down the window, which you can't, there was a police car a foot or a foot and a half to the side of the Beast, of the limousine. There were 4 of them blanketing the car, maybe a foot away, and they were matching our speed, and we're going 85 miles an hour down a freeway. Later, I asked Eddie Morenzel, what that was all about, and he said, we were worried about a car bomber intersecting the motorcade, and we wanted to give, if there was an attack on the motorcade, we wanted to cause the bomb to go off 10 or 15 feet away from the limousine, giving the president a better chance of surviving the blast.
Wow. That's amazing recollection of the absolute details of what transpired that morning as we look back. And Trace, I know you're with us, and we're looking live at Ground Zero, where these ceremonies and remembrances continue throughout the morning.
Yeah, and Karl, I know you've been down to, to the new World Trade Center. I know you've been down and you've seen the 9/11 Museum. And as you walk through, what is it that strikes you most about what you see down there now compared to what you saw 19 years ago?
Well, I've been on the surface of the site of 9/11. I must, to my great shame, I've not been to the museum, and I'll tell you why. I'm afraid of being overcome by the emotions of that day. I mean, there is, you feel so deeply. I've met these people. I met Todd Beamer's parents. I met victims. I mean, when we had the families of the Flight 93 to the White House, imagine, at that point we didn't know. We now pretty well understand that Flight 93 was meant for the Capitol. But in the days and immediately afterwards, we didn't know. And so we were meeting people whose loved one had died protecting, we thought, the White House. And now we know that it was aiming for the Capitol. But I've met these people. And to think of the grief and the pain that these people have suffered in losing the lives of people whose only offense was to be an American and to be either on an airplane or to be in a tower, an office building in Lower Manhattan. I mean, the Bush Presidential Library in Dallas, it has an exhibit devoted to 9/11, and I go to the library a lot for events with the president and activities that are around there, and it's painful, and I'm sure it's painful for everybody who lost a loved one. I admire their courage showing up every year to hear the name of their loved one read at the ceremony at the site. And God bless the leadership of the museum and the town fathers of New York and mothers of New York for continuing that great ceremony there. I think it probably gives some comfort to those who lost someone.
Right. Yeah, and these are all insights that only you can give, Karl. We greatly appreciate your insight today. This riveting.
Karl, thank you,
sir.
You bet.